So welcome everyone to this session of Philosophy Matters, and especially a warm welcome to everyone who's new to the group. So tonight's talk is going to be on effective altruism, combining reason and altruism. So let me say a little about what tonight is going to be about. Effective altruism, or it's sometimes shortened to EA, is a new movement around the not so new idea of combining evidence and reasons with charity and altruism. It focuses on using our limited time and resources to do as much good as we can. Michael Dello-Iacovo will introduce some of the key concepts of effective altruism and discuss some examples and the underlying philosophy. He will also consider some of the common objections to aspects of effective altruism. So a little about Michael. Michael Dello-Iacovo served as CEO of Effective Altruism Australia in 2016 and has been involved with local effective altruism groups in Adelaide and Sydney, including co-founding the Life You Can Save Adelaide. He has a background in science with training in geology, geophysics and climate science, and is currently working on his PhD in space science. Michael has also worked in the energy industry and is the deputy convener for the Animal Justice Party, New South Wales. So please join me in welcoming Michael. So Michael, I'll hand over to you now.
Okay, great. Thanks for that, Les. Hi, everyone. Yeah, thanks so much for being here. Yeah, great to see you all. I've noticed a few familiar faces from the Ex-Religious Support Network group last year that I gave a talk to about sentientism. Okay, so what is effective altruism? As Les said, it's combining charity and science, or empathy and rationality. Basically, I see effective altruism as it's more of a question than an answer. It's the question of, given our limited time and resources, how can we do as much good as possible, or how can we do good more effectively? The idea is that there are a lot of problems in the world that we would love to go away, but we all have limited time, resources, money, energy to try and address these problems. So how can we use those limited resources as effectively as possible to try and do as much good as possible with our time? I guess effective altruism is, it's a relatively new movement. I think that the term effective altruism started getting used around 2009 in the UK is where it kind of started. But it's not really a brand new idea of trying to do charity as effectively as possible. I think this is just the first time that people who thought this way kind of banded together to actually create a whole movement around it. So I'm going to start with a little bit of a story, an analogy, if you will, to hopefully try and get one of the ideas of effective altruism across. If you've been to an introductory EA talk before, this is the analogy that we all use. So you may have heard of the drowning child analogy, coined by, or first described by Peter Singer, an Australian philosopher who was one of the early proponents of effective altruism. So the idea is, imagine you're walking through a park, and as far as you can see, there's no one else around. But when you come to when you walk through the park and you come to this big kind of lake in the middle of this park, you see there's actually one other person there. And unfortunately, there is a child drowning in the pond. So you see them, there's no one else around, the parents or guardians are not there. It's just you and this child. You're wearing some very fancy clothes, let's say, for whatever reason, that cost quite a bit of money. You don't think you have time to take off the clothes to go and save this child, to spare the clothes. So you've got to just jump in, and you'll probably ruin your clothes, get them all muddy, to try and save this child. The lake, is probably only waist high for you, so no risk to your own personal safety or anything. But you will be saving this child's life. So the question is, what do you do in this scenario? And now I would say, and I think most people would say, of course, you should still go and save that child, just because you're going to lose some money in the process if you have to rebuy those clothes that they get ruined. So that's great, but when we start to think about how that applies more broadly, it turns out that there's a lot of people suffering and dying all around the world whose lives could be spared for sometimes as little as several $1,000s. And I'll talk a little bit more about how that is the case a little bit later, but just grant me that for now. Let's say that you can save the life of someone suffering from some disease that they don't need to suffer from, or famine, or whatever else. And you can do so. There are opportunities to do so for as little as several $1,000s. So if it's wrong to not jump into the pond when a child is drowning right in front of you, then should we be thinking about how that applies to a child who's suffering on the other side of the world? And the idea is that just because someone is suffering far away, it doesn't make their suffering any less bad, and it shouldn't mean that we're any less obligated to do it. I think distance is not the relevant factor. It's about whether we can do something about it. So you might think, okay, that's a little bit daunting. Does that mean we should donate all of our money to save people? That's a pretty big obligation. Some people, so there's a discussion around obligation versus opportunity, which I'll talk more about later, but I like to see effective altruism, going back to the question I said before about how can we use our resources as effectively as possible to do good. I like to see it as an opportunity. It turns out we have all these opportunities to do more good with our time or with our money. There are opportunities to literally save lives. And I think that's great. Okay, so effective altruism, when we really get down to it, there are a number of, I guess, causes that people focus on. Effective altruism and effective altruists are not necessarily bound to these causes, but this is just to give a few examples of some of the causes that people within effective altruism tend to focus on. This is not an exclusive list, but some examples might be international development and global health, animal protection, reducing animal suffering, and some other things that are a little bit less, I guess, every day for people to think about, but things that still could affect a lot of lives and a lot of suffering. Things like existential risk events that might have a chance to wipe out all life on Earth, or all human life on Earth, let's say. Things like the possibility of an artificial intelligence runaway scenario, supervolcanoes, asteroid impacts, pandemics, whether natural pandemics or, say, an engineered pandemic, which is made to be as transmissible as the flu, but as deadly as a much more deadly virus. And all those things are all realistic scenarios that can happen, and many of the natural events like supervolcanoes and asteroid impacts that could wipe out all human life or all life on Earth, those things have happened in the past. So even if you think there's a low chance of any of those particular events occurring, the large number of lives that they would affect means that maybe we should spend some time thinking about how we can reduce the likelihood of those events. But I'll talk more about these causes individually a little bit later. This is just to give a bit of an idea of some of the things that people spend their time working on in effective altruism. So I'll start by telling a little bit of a story about GiveWell, which, if you're familiar with effective altruism, that's the name of a charity which has become, I guess that name has become quite synonymous with effective altruism. But in around 2006, the people pictured here, Holden Karnofsky and Eli Hassenfeld, they were both hedge fund managers. They were making a lot of money, and they decided that they wanted to donate some of their wealth, but they wanted their donation to be as effective as possible. Being very science and data driven, they were very interested in looking at different charities and trying to find out if they gave a donation to one charity over another, where would their money be better off going? Where would they do the most good? So they started to look around. There wasn't any resources online, so they started to contact charities directly. But it turns out when they asked for charities for statistics on their effectiveness, they got useless marketing material, or worse yet, got told to bugger off. because it was just in 2006, it was just not really something that people did. People didn't think about charity in the way of, well, if I gave $1 here versus $1 there, where is it going to be more effective? At best, at the time, you might have gotten something like this, which this is from a website called Charity Navigator. So I don't want to make it sound like I'm bagging out Charity Navigator too much, because in their defense, they have, I think, become a lot better in recent years. But at the time, around 2006, they were simply looking at the effectiveness of charities in terms of their expenses breakdown. So how much money was going towards the program. So let's say whatever program that charity was working on. Maybe they had some vaccination program for people in a developing area that didn't have good access to vaccines. So that's their program costs. And then there's also administrative costs that you can't really get around. So at the head office, they have to pay marketing costs to help with fundraising. But the way people saw charity was, if the charity was spending more of a percentage of their money on program costs, it was a better charity. And that's kind of as detailed as it got. But it's not the best measure, because sometimes you do need to spend money on some of the other things. For example, you might need to spend money to hire an expert to make sure that your program is more effective. But that might fall under something like administrative cost. Or if you could spend more money, a little bit more money to raise a lot more money, then I don't think that should be seen as a bad thing. So they weren't able to get what they wanted, Ellie and Holden. So they ended up starting their own organization. They quit their jobs and started GiveWell, which to this day remains one of the best resources online, in my opinion, for looking for evidence-based information about which charities are effective, and a lot of information about their programs and the impact that they have. So all of their information is on their website. It's all freely available. You can go and have a look at any of their historical documents about their reviews of different charities and so on. So I would really recommend that if you're ever thinking about where you might want to donate some money, and they focus mostly on international development and global health organizations. So, but why should we rate charities? Many people believe that it is enough just to donate to charities that are honest. However, there are many honest charities that mean well and but just have programs that don't work. Or unfortunately, in some I guess somewhat rare cases, but in some cases, their programs can even be harmful. And I'll give an example of that in a moment. So honest charities try to do good, but our intuition isn't really good at picking good charities or programs. So there's an organization in the US, which has been running for several decades and is still running today, or at least as of a few years ago when I last checked, they were still running. So when people think about charities, most people assume that all honest charities have positive effects, but this is an example of one that doesn't. So scared straight, nothing wrong with the people who work at the charity, nothing wrong with the founders. They mean very well, I'm sure. So yeah, I'll just talk a little bit about what the program is. So Scared Straight takes teenage delinquents to prison, where they spend 3 hours being yelled at, screamed at, intimidated, and threatened by the guards and inmates. It's all part of a program where the idea is that they're trying to scare the students into not performing crime anymore. The program claims to have a high success rate at reducing recidivism rate of these teenagers, or the rate at which teenagers go back to committing crimes. But as you may have guessed, not only was this program ineffective, it was outright harmful. So out of 9 high quality studies that were performed on the Scared Straight programs, 2 showed that it had no impact, and 7 showed that it had an increase on the teenagers' crime rate. This intervention is more harmful than just doing nothing. And yet the Scared Straight program has continued for many years after these reviews were released. So yeah, in the face of overwhelming evidence, how can that be? Well, Scared Straight looks like it's working because after the program, many of the teenagers do reduce their rates of criminal activity, but this doesn't take into account what would have happened anyway. So it turns out that the teenagers would have, on average, reduced their rate of criminal activity anyway. That's, I guess, it's just a regression to the mean, where because they're already such outliers, people tend to trend back towards the average, in this case, rate of crime. And so over time, they would have reduced their crime rate anyway. But the result, the effect of the Scared Straight program was for their crime rate to reduce less than it otherwise would have. Hope I'm explaining that. Hope I'm explaining that okay. So why does it increase the crime rate relative to doing nothing of this program? It's hard to say. One proposed reason is that rather than acting as a deterrent, the guards and inmates unintentionally act as role models for the engineers, where acting tough and being a rebel becomes something to aspire to. They say things like, you think you're tough enough to survive in here, you wouldn't last a minute. And so that's something they maybe internalize as something they want to aspire to. I think the jury's out on exactly why that happens, but it's pretty clear that children who don't go into the program do better than children who do go into this program. Okay, so it is hard to figure out which programs work. It is really difficult. So trying to find out, trying to measure the impact of a charity is hard to begin with. But of those programs that have been rigorously evaluated, 75% have little to no effect. That is this is programs in kind of the, I guess, human-centered space, not considering like non-human charities, just because they haven't really been looked at as much. But this is 75% of charities that focus on humans have little to no effect. Okay, so going back to what I mentioned before about different causes. So I mentioned 3 causes of global health, non-human animal protection, and thinking about the far future or existential risk. There's a lot of other causes. Those are just some examples. But how do we think about which causes we want to prioritize and which causes we want to focus on? Again, there's a lot of causes, a lot of problems in the world that would be great for it to go away, but sometimes we have to prioritize it a little bit. And this same framework can be used when we're thinking about within a cause area, how do we prioritize different programs or different interventions to try and tackle that problem? So the 3 pillars of cause prioritization are the scale, the solvability, and the neglectedness of that problem. And we need to think about all 3 of them to try and prioritize which causes to focus on. So the scale is just a measure of how bad is the problem, or how good would it be if the problem just went away entirely. So if a problem is big, it's more important to focus on that problem. How solvable is it, or how tractable? So a problem might be massive in scale, but if there's not really anything we can do about it at the moment, maybe we're limited by technology, or maybe it's just a very hard problem to do anything about, that impacts how effective it is to work on that problem. And lastly, neglectedness, that's just a measure of how many resources are already going into this problem, how many people are already working on this problem. Because if a problem is not very neglected, it's quite possible that an additional person going into working on that problem, or a little bit of additional money going towards that problem, won't have as much of an impact as if it went towards a problem that was much more neglected. So we need to think about all of these things in combination to try and work out how we prioritize our time and resources. So I mentioned before that there's an organization that can save the life of a human for as little as a few $1,000s. One of those organizations is the Against Malaria Foundation, and you can read more about them on the GiveWell website. So what do? It's pretty simple. They just distribute anti-malarial bed nets to people in malaria-prone regions. It costs them about $5 to distribute one net. So they purchase the nets, they distribute the nets. And GiveWell estimates that for every $4,500 US donated to the Against Malaria Foundation, they save one life, stop one person from dying of malaria. And that's not the only benefit, because the malaria is not bad just because it kills people. It also makes people very sick. That has impacts on the local communities, and that has a lot of flow-on effects. So what can you do right now, I guess, if you're thinking about the cause area of international development and global health? So one is to support effective charities, for example, see GiveWell. One thing that a lot of people do is, if they're not able to work on a problem directly, a lot of people in the effective altruism community take what's called a giving pledge. So this is where you make it can be just a pledge with yourself, or it can be a public pledge. You just make a promise to donate, say, a certain amount of money every year. It could be a percentage. Maybe you pledge to donate 1%, 10% of your income every year to effective charities. And this is a way that a lot of people who, if they're not directly working on a particular problem, but if they have some additional money that they feel like they don't need, or they feel like that they can spare, then they use that opportunity to donate it to some charities that do a lot of good. Or join your local effective altruism chapter, maybe tell other people about effective altruism, and talk about some of these ideas. Hopefully spreading the idea that it's important to think about evidence when it comes to charities is good. Or work in policy, or I don't have this on the list actually, but directly working for an organization that is working on tackling these problems. So why care about non-humans? So the second cause area I'll talk about in a bit more detail is non-human animal suffering. Primarily, I'm talking about suffering of animals in farms where mostly they are being bred, raised, and killed for consumption by humans. So I think it's I personally think it's pretty clear that the majority of animals in factory farms suffer immensely. Most factory farms in the world, 99% of land animals raised for consumption in the world are raised in factory farms, where the conditions are pretty horrendous, causing them a lot of suffering. I believe that because animals I think the evidence supports that they're sentient, and so that we should, in the same way that we want to reduce human suffering, we should want to reduce non-human suffering. And depending on how you weight animal versus human suffering, so for example, some people say that the suffering of an animal is as important as the suffering of a human. Some people say the suffering of, say, a pig is 10 times less important than the suffering of a human. But it's not that it doesn't matter at all, but maybe they put more weight on a human. But depending on how you weight that, it actually might be more effective to work on animal advocacy than working on poverty, if what you're interested in is reducing suffering or something like that. And there's also a lot of flow-on effects that do benefit humans, so that's what you're more interested in. So less animal agriculture means less emissions, less deforestation, so that impacts things like climate change, less antibiotic resistance, which is expected to kill tens of millions of people in the next few decades, because a lot of antibiotics are fed to non-humans because they're in such tight conditions. Often they get a lot of diseases, so they feed them a lot of antibiotics. Zoonotic disease transmission, a lot of zoonotic diseases, I think around 70% of zoonotic diseases come from, 70% of diseases are zoonotic, and a lot of those come from factory farming conditions where the animals are so close and they're breeding a lot of diseases. So whether that's bacteria or viruses, a lot of diseases do come from animal farming operations. And just pollution in general, a lot of the waste is, depending on where you are in the world, a lot of it is dumped in rivers. I think Australia does a little bit better on this issue, but in terms of things like animal protection law, the deforestation, Australia, I think, ranks pretty poorly on those issues for animal protection, animal farming. And then within the cause of animal protection, so if what you're concerned about most is reducing animal suffering, a lot of people do things like support shelters or focus on clothing, like fur is a pretty common issue. But if you look at the left graph here, so this is a graph from Animal Charity Evaluators, which is basically the GiveWell of the animal protection world. The left graph shows that the vast majority of animals raised, killed, and existing in the US are in farms. Much smaller percentage in labs being used for experimentation. And then even smaller is the number of animals killed for clothing, for things like fur. And then also there's a relatively small amount of number of animals that live in shelters compared to the number of animals that are used and killed in farms. When you look at the right graph, where it shows the amount of money donated to different animal charities, most of the money, about 2/3, is going to animals in shelters. So I think it's fair to say that if we think about the cause prioritization pillars, so shelters are not within that cause area. Shelters are not that high in scale compared to factory farms, and they're not very neglected compared to factory farms if you look at the amount of money donated there. So, and then the amount of money donated to preventing harm to animals in farms or reducing harm to animals in farms, that's a very small percentage of the money donated to animal charities in the US. So I think it's fair to say within the space of animal advocacy, one of the most important areas to focus on is animal farming. So what can you do about this problem now? I can't go past saying that not purchasing animal products is a big way to reduce your personal impact on this issue, but then also donating to an effective animal charity, of which there are many. So Animal Charity Evaluators has a lot of information about this on their website. They look at different animal charities and review them in the same way that GiveWell does. They look at different interventions to help animals. Work or volunteer for an effective animal charity. There are a lot of opportunities to do that online as well. Same for working or volunteering with international development organizations. There are a lot of opportunities to volunteer online and remotely these days, or advocate effectiveness to other animal advocates. Maybe you're an animal advocate yourself and you know some other animal advocates who don't necessarily think about animal protection in this way through the lens of evidence. And I think encouraging people to think about that is important and valuable. And again, work in policy or directly working on the problem. So existential risk, as I mentioned, events that may cause the extinction of all human life, like the global thermonuclear war, or asteroid impact, or something like that. So an event like that would be bad because it would kill a lot of people, but it would also arguably be bad because it prevents, if it wipes out all human life, let's say, it would prevent any future humans from being born. And I think we should value future lives in the same way that we should value people who are alive today, because if people in the future, if we expect them to have good, positive, happy lives, then I think we should want them to be able to experience that. I think it's these sorts of existential threat risks, they're less, I should say, they're more likely than I think a lot of people think. So some experts suggest that there may be less than a 1 in 2 chance of humanity reaching 2100. That's probably one of the more pessimistic predictions. Some people think 5% chance of going extinct by 2100. Yeah, I think the key message is just that as technology continues to improve, it means that we have that can be a positive thing, but it can also be a negative thing. It's becoming easier for one person to do more and more damage every year on year. If you think about if someone wanted to kill a lot of people 200 years ago, they'd find it a lot more difficult than they would today. And now we're getting into a stage where people potentially have access to things like nuclear weapons and other weapons that can cause a lot of damage. And I think it may well be a matter of time before small either rogue nations or terrorist groups or individuals have the chance to to potentially wipe out all of humanity with maybe an engineered pandemic or a nuclear weapon. But even if we do secure the future, even if we do manage to navigate all these possible existential risk events, how good would the future be for sentient life? I think it's important that we make sure that if there is a future, that it is good and that it's not, it doesn't end up being a scenario where it's just full of suffering and it's a terrible time for everyone. So how can we make sure that the far future is better if there is one for sentient life? And now our impact on the future, it is very hard to measure. In a world where measuring our impact is already very hard, how do we think about measuring our impact on people who will live 100 years from now? It's very, very difficult. We can make estimates, but it is a huge challenge. But having said that, our impact on the future is probably going to be pretty big based on our actions today, just because of the flow-on effects, the number of lives that will influence in the future with our actions today will be great. Just because it's hard to measure our impact doesn't mean we shouldn't try and do our best to make sure that our impact is positive and not negative. So if you're compelled by this, what can you do now? A lot of demand for researchers in this field. So people working on things like artificial intelligence safety researchers or policy, people working on global coordination initiatives to reduce the risk of some kind of like global thermonuclear war scenario. There's an organization called the, it's just slipped my mind, but there's an organization specifically working on reducing the likelihood of a nuclear war scenario. Support existing organizations doing work on these issues, value spreading. So this is an idea where it's hard to directly influence the future, or hard to know how our influence will influence the future. But what we can do that's probably a safe bet is spread what we think are good values that we think would be good for people in the future to hold. And by spreading those values today, we can be somewhat confident that that's increasing the likelihood that people in the future will have those values. So the example I like to use is expanding the moral circle. So over time, the moral circle of people has continued to grow. We've gone from a time where hundreds and thousands of years ago, people typically only cared about themselves, so the people most immediately near them. Then people started to care about people a little bit more and more by distance. And now I think we're at a point where most people care about people all around the world and would be happy to do something to help them if they could. But not just talking about distance, also talking about how different someone is from themselves. So for a long time, people didn't care about some people didn't care about people who weren't their gender, didn't share their race or their culture. I think that's becoming less of the case today. We still have some work to do. But also now people are starting to expand that moral circle to include other species. So not just caring about humans, but caring about other sentient species, other non-human animals. So spreading those values of expanding the moral circle today, I think is a good way, hopefully, to make sure that that value is spread into the future as well, into people who live in the future are more likely to have those values. So I'll talk a little bit about some common objections to effective altruism. These are all real objections that have people have written articles about and so on to I guess critique effective altruism. I'll talk about this in a little bit of detail, but if someone wants me to talk about any of these more, I'm happy to do that after in the Q&A, or if someone else has maybe another objection that they have thought of or that they've heard, I can try and talk about that a little bit. So the first is, some people might say, well, it's too demanding to live like this. And I can very well sympathize with that. It does feel sometimes demanding to feel like you have to change the way you live to do as much good as you can. But as I said before, I prefer to think about it in terms of an opportunity. So there are a lot of opportunities that we have to do a lot of good. Well, I guess personally, I try to do as much as I can without severely impacting my own well-being and my own mental health. I don't think it's fair to say that I should do that there should never be a trade-off between my own personal well-being. I think sometimes I should be happy to, personally, I think I should be happy to sacrifice some of my well-being sometimes to do a lot of good if I can. But I mean, I think this is I guess somewhat of a personal issue that people should approach for themselves, think about for themselves, how much can they feel like, do they feel like they can do without impacting their well-being, or how much well-being do they think they can sacrifice for themselves, whilst trying to do as much good as they can for others. With this question, it's important to think about, I guess, your own, the longevity of you in terms of someone who is doing good for others. If you sacrifice too much personal well-being, for some people that's just too demanding and they're going to burn out, and then they're not going to be a very effective advocate or activist or person helping others. So yeah, this is a tricky one to navigate, because it'll be different for different people, and some people are more happy to sacrifice some of their own well-being. But I guess I think this one's actually quite a fair objection. But I think what the response should be is you should try and do as much good as you can without sacrificing your own well-being as much as possible. Some people say, shouldn't charity start at home? So why? I mean, we're in Australia. Why are we talking about trying to solve problems overseas when there are still problems in Australia? That's true. There are still problems in Australia that we could try and address. So couple of points on this. So first is that Australia is a relatively well-off nation, and there are a lot more opportunities to do good overseas in developing nations. So I guess there's a lot more low-hanging fruit in other nations compared to Australia, where a lot of the opportunities to do a lot of good we already have a lot of infrastructure, a lot of a pretty good public health system. Those are things that make a huge difference, but not a lot of other countries necessarily have or do as well as Australia. So there are a lot of opportunities to do more good in other countries. And also, as I said before, I don't think it should matter where someone is. Just because someone is further away from you, I don't think that makes their suffering any less valid to them. So we should, I think, be thinking about charity in terms of where can we do the most good, rather than thinking about it in terms of wanting to focus on the local problems. So we should be thinking about where can we do the most good possible. Some people say that effective altruism has too much focus on band-aid solutions and not enough focus on systemic change, or not enough focusing on the underlying problem. So, for example, something like a charity that there's a charity called Give Directly, which is rated quite highly by GiveWell. And Give Directly, what they do is pretty simple. They just give people money because there's evidence that giving people money in developing areas, that actually has a really big positive influence on a lot of different outcomes, like the rate at which children go to school and their health and their well-being. So some people say that that's more of a band-aid solution because it doesn't really address the underlying problem of why there is that area that's underdeveloped in the first place. So that's true. I think in that was more of a valid criticism, I think, in the early days of effective altruism, where there was much more of a focus on these so-called band-aid solutions. I think that term almost has negative connotations, but so first, in recent years, I think that's become less of the case as effective altruism has matured. There's a lot more resources going into organizations that are looking at how we can more effectively do good. And I think they're thinking more about systematic change. systematic change is very hard to measure it's very hard to measure the impact compared to something more direct, like what GiveWell does or what the Against Malaria Foundation does. Those kinds of programs, it's relatively easy to just measure the impact that they're having. Whereas systematic change, it's very hard to predict or to measure what the actual impact would be. They often have large-scale systemic changes, often have some unforeseen consequences, whether positive or negative, which can be hard to predict. So I think, yeah, I guess I probably don't have too much else to say about that one. But just that, yeah, I think it's something that a lot of people in effective altruism are aware of and working to try and address. So what if I'm not a utilitarian? I talk a lot about effective altruism through the lens of, I guess, suffering and well-being. I use that language mostly because I myself am a utilitarian. But if you're not a utilitarian, I think that's fine. I think there's still a place for you in effective altruism, or to use the effective altruism mindset. So effective altruism tends to attract a lot of utilitarians because it's a lot about evidence and trying to work out which action would do the most good. But I think the only thing you really need to be an effective altruist is just to think that you want to try and do some good, and you're interested in using evidence to try and make sure that what you're doing is actually good, is not having a negative impact, and maybe that you're thinking about it in terms of how can I do as much good as possible? How can I do more good? So I don't think you have to be utilitarian to think like that. And of course, a lot of effective altruists are not utilitarian. They're just interested in, as I said, the question of how they can use their time resources as effectively as possible to do what they think is good. So, okay, for this last part, I'm going to talk about a little bit more detail about what are some different things that people in the effective altruist movement do. Some people do multiple of these things. I personally have done or tried a lot of the stuff that I'm going to talk about here. So I'll give some personal anecdotes, I guess, of what I've done, hopefully just to give people ideas of the sorts of things that people in effective altruism do. So one is join a local effective altruism group. I think there's one in pretty much every major city in Australia now. There's at least a local effective altruism chapter. Some of the effective altruism chapters are under the brand of The Life You Can Save, or Giving What We Can, or some of them are just called Effective Altruism Sydney, for example. There's a lot of them that are tied to university groups, but not necessarily always the case. And this is just a great way to meet people who are like-minded and to talk about ideas about how we can do good and what it means to us to live an ethical life. And I guess it's just a good social environment. And I think there's a lot of value in community building if we want to, I guess if we don't want people to burn out and to leave the movement, then there should be a somewhat of a social element to keep people together and talking and engaged. So for me personally, when I was living in Adelaide in around 2015, that's when I found out about effective altruism by watching Peter Singer's TED Talk on YouTube. And so I emailed Peter Singer, asking him how to get involved, because I thought, this is great. This is how I think about charity. And it turns out there's a whole movement of people who think about charity like this. So I was very excited because I didn't know many people in my own life who thought about it that way. And I was pretty surprised he actually got back to me within like 10 minutes and said, you should start your own chapter you should start an effective altruism chapter in Adelaide, because there wasn't one at the time. So together with Louise Pfeiffer, who moved from Melbourne and was involved with the effective altruism chapter in Melbourne, she moved to Adelaide, and we co-founded the Life You Can Save Adelaide, which is the first EA group in that city. But you don't have to found an effective altruism group to get involved. There's plenty of groups that already exist that you can that they're all quite welcoming, and you can join and or go along to one of their events. Work or volunteer for an effective altruism organization. So there are a lot of different effective altruism organizations that work on a lot of different things. There are organizations that work on community building, like The Life You Can Save, Giving What We Can, and some other ones. There are organizations that work on doing research to try and find out what are the opportunities to do good, like GiveWell, Animal Charity Evaluators. And there's a lot of organizations that do more specific research, focusing on, say, one particular problem and just trying to work out how they can solve that problem, or even directly doing work to try and address some problem, like maybe they have some program or intervention that they undertake. And there's a lot of organizations that, I guess, there's not like a hierarchy of organizations that are effective altruist organizations, but I think a lot of organizations identify as being effective altruism aligned, which just means they think that they should be using evidence to try and evidence reason to try and do as much good as they can as an organization. So I think there are opportunities to either work or volunteer for one of these organizations. And I would say that a lot of these organizations are quite talent constrained, in that they would benefit from, there's a big opportunity for people with talents that they need to come in and do some work for them. And I think they need all sorts of different skills, anything you can think of that a business might need. So there's the direct work of what they do, but also things like marketing or advertising or web development and everything else that a nonprofit or an organization might need. So I personally have, they no longer exist, but Charity Science was an effective altruism organization that I did a volunteer internship with for a few months. And there's a lot of similar organizations or opportunities to do that, to do something like that. So I spoke about, I did some research on the most effective ways to raise money for charities. And then I've also worked, as I said in my introduction, I've worked with Effective Altruism Australia. I was first their public engagement officer, and then took on a paid role as the first CEO of the organization. And there's a lot of other organizations that there are opportunities to work for. Some people, as I said, they donate to effective organizations or take a giving pledge. Not too much else to say about that. I guess that's pretty self-explanatory, I think. But I personally have taken a pledge to every year give everything I earn over a certain amount of money. And I guess the reason I took them, the reason I made that pledge public, I've outlined in detail how much I'll give on my website. And the reason I did that is one, to lock myself in to doing that. So I believe that that's something that I want to do for the rest of my life. And by making that pledge public, that I think has sort of made me committed to doing that, because I don't want to go back on my word. But that's something I wanted to do to make sure that I do that in the long term. And the other reason is I think it's important to spread social norms that we think are good. So a social norm that I think is good is people to, not just for people to donate more, but also people to just be more open and more willing to talk about charity. I think a lot of people see charity as being something that you don't really talk about. But I think personally we should talk a little bit more about giving to charities and what we think are effective opportunities to give to charities and so on. So hopefully by making that pledge public, I've encouraged some people to talk a little bit more about that. And so Giving What We Can, who I've already mentioned, they I guess on their website, they have a pledge you can take to donate a certain amount of money each year or something like that on their website. And that's something that a lot of people have done. So if you're a student or if you're undertaking postgraduate research, you could think about doing your research on topics that would have a high impact. a lot of research topics that we don't know the answer to that could have a really high impact in a lot of different fields, whether it's international development or so on. A lot of unanswered questions that could be really impactful. So there is an organization called Effective Thesis who have a website. They give potential students for doing, say, like an honors thesis or a PhD thesis. They give advice to students who are thinking about that. They have a list of ideas for theses on their website that they think would be really effective questions to answer with someone's research. And it depends on the program you get into, but often there are opportunities to be a bit flexible with the research program, the research that you're doing for your thesis. So for me personally, I'm just finishing my thesis now. I've submitted my thesis a few weeks ago. And I chose my topic with, I guess, effective altruism in mind. I did my undergraduate degree in geoscience and geophysics, and I wanted to work on a program, work in a project that would have a combine my existing skill set, but still have a high impact. And so I ended up working on asteroid impact deflection, asteroid mining, and a few other things, but mostly doing lab work to test tools that would be used for those kinds of missions. And the idea was that I wanted to combine my geoscience skill set with something that would have a big impact, something that would affect the far future, like reducing the risk of asteroid impacts. That's just an example, but yeah, I was able to talk to my supervisor and talk about a project that would interest me, but that was something that they could still get funding for at the university. And so, yeah, if you're thinking about doing a thesis, then I would encourage you to have a look at this website and to think about maybe what you could work on that would be impactful. And finally, a job or career. We spend, the average person spends about 80,000 hours working in their life. That's a lot of hours that if you could make those hours just a little bit more effective at doing good, that would add up to a very big impact in the long run. So there's two organizations that I know of that within the Effective Altruism banner that give resources and help people think about how they can use their careers to do as much good as they can, or how to just do a little bit more good with their career. So all of their resources, I think, are free. They also have coaching, which I think I understand they tend to be pretty busy, but they do offer coaching services for people thinking about if they're thinking about a career change or not sure what career to go into in the first place. They give you some things to think about to help you try and find a satisfying and impactful career. And working to create political and legal change can be impactful as well. So whether that's something like just lobbying your local member of government to support something that you think would be good and effective, or getting involved in politics yourself. So personally, I've become involved with a political party in Australia, the Animal Justice Party. I've run as a candidate a few times because I believe that working to create political change and legal change to address primarily problems relating to animal protection and animal suffering, I think that's a very neglected and very impactful way to use my time and skills to try and do a lot of good. And that's all I've got. So I've got some more resources that you could have a look at. I mean, that's by no means exhaustive. There are a lot of organizations and websites, blogs as well. I think blogs are actually really good resources within the Effective Altruism community. A lot of people have blogs that they put a lot of time and thought into that you can go have a look at. If someone's interested in anything in particular, they can ask that as a question, I guess, and I'd be happy to try and point them in the right direction. But that's all I have for now, and happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael. I think that's been a really great insight into the philosophy behind effective altruism, and you've given us a really great practical guide on how we can now apply that, what practical things each of us can get involved in. So before we open up for questions, I just want to let people know that you can access the videos and the podcasts of previous Philosophy Matters sessions by visiting the resource section of my Rational Realm website. Now it's at www.rationalrealm.com. And from there, you can also download Michael's presentation slides and slides of previous sessions as well. So thank you again, Michael, for a really great session. So I've got a question first from David Week.
Hi, David. Thanks for that talk, and I really appreciate and value your overall orientation towards life. I guess I've got two questions that I come out of this for me, and I think they're both oriented somewhat towards critiques of utilitarianism. So the first is like in the way that you've described figuring out where impact lies or effectiveness lies. You've talked about it as though it's a kind of scientific, rational, process. But science is the way that we approach the world. And for instance, there's NGOs like, and Give Directly is one of them, and Kiva is another one, which actually just put money into people's hands on the basis that they are the best person to decide what is most positive and impactful. So I'll give you both questions at the same time. So that's one. What about the participation of the so-called beneficiary in this whole decision-making process? What's to be done? And the second, you often talked a couple of times about spreading good values. Now, I'm of the view that we think our values are the best, because if we thought some other values were better, well, we'd have those values. De facto, we think we have the best values. But the people that came here, a couple of hundred years ago and tried to basically eliminate Aboriginal culture through Christianization or civilization, thought in many cases they were doing the right thing. And John Howard, in fact, refused to apologize for the stolen children generation. Specifically, he said, because people at the time thought they were doing the right thing. So I just want to talk about like who decides the form of the assistance and whose values, perhaps to be wary of our own values. Thanks.
Sure, thanks, David. Great question. So I'll start with the first one, which is about making sure that the people we're trying to help, I guess, are involved in the decision-making process. So yeah, I think that's really important. Often the people who live in these areas where there are people where they're trying to help, they know they have sometimes often a better idea of what the problem is and what they actually need. So I think that just means that it's important that we make sure we do involve people who have the local context, and that we do ask people what they need. Make sure that's part of what we're doing. But I don't think we should solely rely on their take on what they think they need, because often people don't really know what they need, and people might think they need one thing, but actually, if there was some other program that would make them more happy, it's tricky. But I mean, we do have some evidence on what increases people's well-being in terms of different programs. So yeah, I think it's important we make sure that we're taking their views into consideration and being respectful, but also recognizing that sometimes there are. I mean, we should also be taking taking into consideration what experts on, say, international development have to say about how money and how programs should be spent to have as much impact as possible. The second question about values, yes, that's an excellent point. If we're going to be spreading values, we want to make sure that they're the right values and they actually are good values. How we do that can be tricky, because, as you said, some people hundreds of years ago doing bad things, and maybe even today, probably think they're doing the right thing, but as we know today, they were not. That's just an answer. That's a question I don't really have a simple answer for, other than to just say we should try and be humble as possible about our views, and to be open-minded, and to recognize that we are probably wrong about a lot of things, and we should just try and be as willing as possible to change our mind when presented with information that leads us to do so. So,
Akiva, you have a question.
Thank you, Liz. Thank you, Michael. Really interesting. Having heard you speak on effective altruism before and sentientism, I'm just wondering if from a moral point of view, given the prioritization question which you raise, whether generally in terms of the values that humans hold, one may choose in many regards to privilege impacts on more intelligent animals. So that's possible, obviously, within the animal kingdom, but arguably also as the peak kind of intelligence, supposedly ourselves, whether we may choose to privilege reducing human suffering and increasing human well-being over animals more generally. What your thoughts are on that? Thank you.
Sure, thanks, Akiva. I think there are some possibly good reasons to privilege humans over non-humans, and some possibly not so good reasons. So one is that if it is the case that humans are, say, have a greater depth of consciousness, or they're able to have a greater capacity for suffering and for well-being than non-humans, then maybe we should say, if a human has a 10 times greater capacity for suffering, then maybe we should rate their suffering as 10 times more important than the suffering of some non-human animal. So, well, I think this is going to depend on the philosophical school of thought that someone subscribes to. As a utilitarian, that's how I think about it. But I'd be a little bit wary, just because I think people tend to overestimate how special and unique humans actually are. And I also don't think that intelligence is necessarily the right trait to be using to make that judgment. So, I mean, there are some humans who are much more intelligent than other humans, but we don't use that as I don't think we should use it as a justification for rating their suffering as less valuable than the suffering of some other human. And so I don't think we should apply that cross-species either. But I think that the capacity for suffering is a relevant trait. But I think there's more, especially recently, we're starting to become aware that it's possible that non-human animals actually some of them might have a greater capacity for suffering than humans. And if that's the case, then I think by that logic, maybe we should be going in the other direction. And just quickly as an aside, the reason that may be the case is, well, for a lot of senses, we know that non-human animals have better senses in some categories than humans. Like dogs have a much greater sense of smell, for example, by many orders of magnitude, I think. And if there are animals that have greater senses of smell, then surely there's animals who have greater senses of touch and pain. And so if an animal can experience pain much more acutely than a human, that's relevant. And also, because humans are more intelligent, we haven't needed to evolve to place as much emphasis on using pain as a tool to ensure our survival. Whereas other species that aren't as intelligent, maybe they've relied more on pain, and so they feel pain more acutely than a human. That, I think, that's maybe jury's still out on that. But yeah, I'd be wary of. I think it's good to have these discussions about where we should place the weight, but assuming that humans are number one in this sense, I think, is a mistake, and we should really think about by some measures they might be, by some measures they might not be, and we should, I guess, think about that through that lens. So yeah.
Thank you very much.
Kathy, you have a question.
Michael, thank you very much for the presentation. Look, I have to admit, I work in international development and humanitarian response. And I really admire the work for effective altruism with regard to being able to get people together, encourage people to give to charities, and to actually discuss those kind of things. However, I find it somewhat surprising. Just, the focus on the evidence is great. We want to focus on evidence. But the trick is the things that, for example, GiveWell is recommending, are the things which are like 8 out of 9 of them are supplies, and they're given by volunteers often. So it's much easier to actually calculate that. Now, the giving cash, fully support that. There's many cash-based programs at the moment that are fabulous. But I'm just surprised, for the direction of international development is very much on system strengthening. It's how to stop the child jumping in the river or being pushed in the river rather than pulling it out of the river. Well, it's doing both, pull it out of the river, but it's also stop them going in. So it's a system strengthening. It's focusing on organizations from the global south, looking at, so I'm just wondering, you seem to have just focused on like 5% of international development humanitarian response because they're the things you can measure. Does that make sense? Like it's easier to measure when you've got volunteers handing out, mosquito nets. How about humanitarian response? How about refugees? How about internally displaced people? How about things like child protection and education, which like you can't measure them, but they're extremely valuable. And then just, the strengthening of governments, of system support, the strengthening of local actors, of local NGOs, just seem to have, it seems to be a simplistic approach to actually, yes, it's evidence-based, beautiful, and I fully support all the things that are on there, but you've just narrowed down the things that you can measure, and then you've avoided all the system stuff. So it strikes me a bit of, you sort of recommend like the white saviorism, volunteers coming in and not supporting the local actors because that's like a grey area and there's uncertain costs there. So if you can just make a comment on that, I'd appreciate, it's great direction. I'd just like you to broaden your recommendations.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for the question. So, well, to start with, I'll go back to the, what I said at the start of the talk, which is effective altruism is more of a question, or that's how I see it at least, than something like an answer, because the movement and just in general, we're continuing to learn more about different ways to do good. The focus on effective altruism has changed over the years as we've learned more and gathered more evidence. I guess what I'm trying to say with that is, there might be some things in effective altruism that people aren't focusing enough on, or that people are wrong about. But that, I don't think that's necessarily a critique about the idea of effective altruism itself. That might be a valid critique of how effective altruism is operating now. But that's a good point. So, I think you've hit the nail on the head with where the problem is, and that's that systemic change is hard to measure. Direct programs are easier to measure, I should say. But I think that's that. If we want to make sure that what we're doing is evidence-based, then that's almost just the reality that we have to deal with. If we want to make sure that our money is going to things that have a lot of evidence behind them, if something is hard to measure, it's just hard to get evidence for it. And it's a bit of a double-edged sword, because systemic change could be really great and cause a lot of good, but there is a lot of potential for systemic change to backfire and to not do so much good and to maybe cause some harm. And if we can't easily measure the impacts, then that is a consideration that we have to take. But having said that, I absolutely think we should be trying to do more to measure the impacts of systemic change, or to predict the impacts of systemic change, and to support effective systemic change as well. And as I said, I think the movement is trending in that direction anyway, of becoming, of talking more about systemic change.
I just want to remind everyone about where to get the previous videos and podcasts, and subscribing to the podcast. If you go to the rationalrealm.com website, rationalrealm.com, and go to the resources section, you'll see the video podcasts and downloads subsection in there.